Section 6 of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis. Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 6. Agitation continued. Political parties, their origin, changes, and modifications. Some account of the popular sovereignty or non-intervention theory. Rupture of the Democratic Party. The John Brown raid. Resolutions introduced by the author into the Senate on the relations of the States, the Federal Government, and the Territories, their discussion and adoption. The strife in Kansas and the agitation of the territorial question in Congress and throughout the country continued during nearly the whole of Mr. Buchanan's administration, finally culminating in a disruption of the Union. Meantime, the changes or modifications which had occurred or were occurring in the great political parties were such as may require a word of explanation to the reader not already familiar with their history. The names adopted by political parties in the United States have not always been strictly significant of their principles. The old Federal party inclined to nationalism or consolidation rather than federalization of the states. On the other hand, the party originally known as Republican and afterward as Democratic can scarcely claim to have been distinctively or exclusively such in the primary sense of these terms, inasmuch as no party has ever avowed opposition to the general principles of government by the people. The fundamental idea of the Democratic Party was that of the sovereignty of the states and the federal or confederate character of the Union. Other elements have entered into its organization at different periods, but this has been the vital, cardinal, and abiding principle on which its existence has been perpetuated. The Whig, which succeeded the old Federal party, though by no means identical with it, was in the main favorable to a strong central government, therein antagonizing the transatlantic traditions connected with its name. The Know Nothing or American party, which sprang into existence on the decadence of the Whig organization, based upon opposition to the alleged overgrowth of the political influence of naturalized foreigners and of the Roman Catholic Church, had but a brief duration, and after the presidential election of 1856 declined as rapidly as it had arisen. At the period to which this narrative has advanced, the Free Soil, which had now assumed the title of Republican Party, had grown to a magnitude which threatened speedily to obtain entire control of the government. Based, as has been shown, upon sectional rivalry and opposition to the growth of the Southern equality with the Northern states of the Union, it had absorbed within itself not only the abolitionists, who were avowedly agitating for the destruction of the system of Negro servitude, but other diverse and heterogeneous elements of opposition to the Democratic party. In the presidential election of 1856, their candidates, Fremont and Dayton, had received 114 of a total of 296 electoral votes, representing a popular vote of 1,341,264 in a total of 4,053,967. The elections of the ensuing year, 1857, exhibited a diminution of the so-called Republican strength, and the 35th Congress, which convened in December of that year, was decidedly Democratic in both branches. In the course of the next 2 years, however, the Kansas agitation, and another cause to be presently noticed, had so swollen the ranks of the so-called Republicans that in the House of Representatives of the 36th Congress, which met in December, 1859, neither party had a decided majority, the balance of power being held by a few members still adhering to the virtually extinct Whig and American or Know-Nothing organizations, and a still smaller number whose position was doubtful or irregular. More than 8 weeks were spent in the election of a Speaker, and a so-called Republican, Mr. Pennington of New Jersey, was finally elected by a majority of 1 vote. The Senate continued to be decidedly Democratic, though with an increase of the so-called Republican minority. The cause above alluded to as contributing to the rapid growth of the so-called Republican Party after the elections of the year 1857 was the dissension among the Democrats occasioned by the introduction of the doctrine called by its inventors and advocates popular sovereignty or non-intervention, but more generally and more accurately known as squatter sovereignty. Its character has already been concisely stated in the preceding chapter. Its origin is generally attributed to General Cass, who is supposed to have suggested it in some general expressions of his celebrated Nicholson letter, written in December, 1847. On the 16th and 17th of May, 1860, it became necessary for me in a debate in the Senate to review that letter of Mr. Cass. From my remarks then made, the following extract is taken. Quote, "The Senator, Mr. Douglas, might have remembered, if he had chosen to recollect so unimportant a thing, that once I had to explain to him 10 years ago the fact that I repudiated the doctrine of that letter at the time it was published, and that the Democracy of Mississippi had well nigh crucified me for the construction which I placed on it. There were men mean enough to suspect that the construction I gave to the Nicholson letter was prompted by the confidence and affection I felt for General Taylor. At a subsequent period, however, Mr. Cass thoroughly reviewed it. He uttered, for him, very harsh language against all who had doubted the true construction of his letter, and he construed it just as I had done during the canvass of 1848. It remains only to add that I supported Mr. Cass, not because of the doctrine of the Nicholson letter, but in despite of it, because I believed a Democratic President, with a Democratic Cabinet and Democratic counselors in the 2 houses of Congress, and he as honest a man as I believed Mr. Cass to be, would be a safer reliance than his opponent, who personally possessed my confidence as much as any man living, but who was of, and must draw his advisers from, a party the tenets of which I believed to be opposed to the interest of the country, as they were to all my political convictions. I little thought at that time that my advocacy of Mr. Cass upon such grounds as these, or his support by the State of which I am a citizen, would at any future day be quoted as an endorsement of the opinions contained in the Nicholson letter, as those opinions were afterward defined. But it is not only upon this letter, but equally upon the resolutions of the convention as constructive of that letter, that the Senator rested his argument. I will here say to the Senator that if any time I do him the least injustice, speaking as I do from such notes as I could take while he progressed, I will thank him to correct me. But this letter entered into the canvass. There was a doubt about its construction. There were men who asserted that they had positive authority for saying that it meant that the people of a territory could only exclude slavery when the territory should form a constitution and be admitted as a state. This doubt continued to hang over the construction, and it was that doubt alone which secured Mr. Cass the vote of Mississippi. If the true construction had been certainly known, he would have had no chance to get it." Whatever meaning the generally discreet and conservative statesman Mr. Cass may have intended to convey, it is not at all probable that he foresaw the extent to which these suggestions would be carried and the consequences that would result from it. In the organization of a government for California in 1850, the theory was more distinctly advanced, but it was not until after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Bill in 1854 that it was fully developed under the plastic and constructive genius of the Hon. Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. The leading part which that distinguished senator had borne in the authorship and advocacy of the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, which affirmed the right of the people of the territories "to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way, subject only to the Constitution of the United States," had aroused against him a violent storm of denunciation in the state which he represented and other northern states. He met it very manfully in some respects, defended his action resolutely, but in so doing was led to make such concessions of principle and to attach such an interpretation to the bill as would have rendered it practically nugatory, a thing to keep the promise of peace to the ear and break it to the hope. The Constitution expressly confers upon Congress the power to admit new states into the Union, and also to "dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States." Under these grants of power, the uniform practice of the government had been for Congress to lay off and divide the common territory by convenient boundaries for the formation of future states, to provide executive, legislative, and judicial departments of government for such territories during their temporary and provisional period of pupilage, to delegate to these governments such authority as might be expedient, subject always to the supervision and controlling government of the Congress. Finally, at the proper time and on the attainment by the territory of sufficient strength and population for self-government, to receive it into the Union on a footing of entire equality with the original states, sovereign and self-governing. All this is no more inconsistent with the true principles of popular sovereignty, properly understood, than the temporary subjection of a minor to parental control is inconsistent with the doctrines of the Declaration of Independence, or the exceptional discipline of a man of war or a military post with the principles of republican freedom. The usual process of transition from a territorial condition to that of a state was, in the first place, by an act of Congress authorizing the inhabitants to elect representatives for a convention to form a state constitution, which was then submitted to Congress for approval and ratification. On such ratification, the supervisory control of Congress was withdrawn, and the new state authorized to assume its sovereignty, and the inhabitants of the territory became citizens of a state. In the cases of Tennessee in 1796 and Arkansas and Michigan in 1836, the failure of the inhabitants to obtain an enabling act of Congress before organizing themselves very nearly caused the rejection of their applications for admission as states, though they were eventually granted on the ground that the subsequent approval and consent of Congress could heal the prior irregularity. The entire control of Congress over the whole subject of territorial government had never been questioned in earlier times. Necessarily conjoined with the power of this protectorate was, of course, the duty of exercising it for the safety of the persons and property of all citizens of the United States, permanently or temporarily resident in any part of the domain belonging to the states in common. Logically carried out, the new theory of popular sovereignty would apply to the first adventurous pioneers settling in the wilderness before the organization of any territorial government by Congress, as well as afterward. If sovereignty is inherent in 1,000 or 5,000 persons, there can be no valid ground for denying its existence in a dozen, as soon as they pass beyond the limits of the state governments. The advocates of this novel doctrine, however, if rightly understood, generally disavowed any claim to its application prior to the organization of a territorial government. The territorial legislatures, to which Congress delegated a portion of its power and duty to "make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory," were the mere agents of Congress, exercising an authority subject to congressional supervision and control, an authority conferred only for the sake of convenience and liable at any time to be revoked and annulled. Yet it is proposed to recognize in these provisional, subordinate, and temporary legislative bodies a power not possessed by Congress itself. This is to claim that the creature is endowed with an authority not possessed by the Creator, or that the stream has risen to an elevation above that of its source. Furthermore, in contending for a power in the territorial legislatures permanently to determine the fundamental social and political institutions of the territory, and thereby virtually to prescribe those of the future state, the advocates of popular sovereignty were investing those dependent and subsidiary bodies with powers far above any exercised by the legislatures of the fully organized and sovereign states. The authority of the state legislatures is limited, both by the federal constitution and by the respective state constitutions from which it is derived. This latter limitation did not and could not exist in the territories. Strange as it may seem, a theory founded on fallacies so flimsy and leading to conclusions so paradoxical was advanced by eminent and experienced politicians, and accepted by many persons both in the North and in the South, not so much perhaps from intelligent conviction as under the delusive hope that it would afford a satisfactory settlement of the irrepressible conflict which had been declared. The terms popular sovereignty and non-intervention were plausible, specious, and captivating to the public ear. Too many lost sight of the elementary truth that political sovereignty does not reside in unorganized or partially organized masses of individuals, but in the people of regularly and permanently constituted states. As to the non-intervention proposed, it meant merely the abnegation by Congress of its duty to protect the inhabitants of the territories subject to its control. The raid into Virginia under John Brown, already notorious as a fanatical partisan leader in the Kansas troubles, occurred in October, 1859, a few weeks before the meeting of the 36th Congress. Insignificant in itself and in its immediate results, it afforded a startling revelation of the extent to which sectional hatred and political fanaticism had blinded the conscience of a class of persons in certain states of the Union, forming a party steadily growing stronger in numbers as well as in activity. Sympathy with its purposes or methods was earnestly disclaimed by the representatives of all parties in Congress, but it was charged, on the other hand, that it was only the natural outgrowth of doctrines and sentiments which for some years had been freely avowed on the floors of both houses. A committee of the Senate made a long and laborious investigation of the facts, with no very important or satisfactory results. In their final report, June 15, 1860, Accompanying the evidence obtained and submitted, this committee said, quote, "It (the incursion) was simply the act of lawless ruffians under the sanction of no public or political authority, distinguishable only from ordinary felonies by the ulterior ends in contemplation by them, and by the fact that the money to maintain the expedition and the large armament they brought with them had been contributed and furnished by the citizens of other States of the Union under circumstances that must continue to jeopard the safety and peace of the Southern States, and against which Congress has no power to legislate. If the several States," adds the committee, "whether from motives of policy or desire to preserve the peace of the Union, if not from fraternal feeling, do not hold it incumbent on them, after the experience of the country, to guard in future by appropriate legislation against occurrences similar to the one here inquired into, the committee can find no guarantee elsewhere for the security of peace between the States of the Union." On February 2nd, 1860, the author submitted in the Senate of the United States a series of resolutions, afterward slightly modified, to read as follows: 1. Resolved that in the adoption of the Federal Constitution, the States, adopting the same, acted severally as free and independent sovereignties, delegating a portion of their powers to be exercised by the Federal Government for the increased security of each against dangers, domestic as well as foreign, and that any intermeddling by any one or more States, or by a combination of their citizens, with the domestic institutions of the others, on any pretext whatever, political, moral, or religious, with the view to their disturbance or subversion, is in violation of the Constitution, insulting to the States so interfered with, endangers their domestic peace and tranquillity, objects for which the Constitution was formed, and by necessary consequence tends to weaken and destroy the Union itself. 2. Resolved, that negro slavery, as it exists in 15 States of this Union, composes an important portion of their domestic institutions, inherited from our ancestors, and existing at the adoption of the Constitution, by which it is recognized as constituting an important element in the apportionment of powers among the States, and that no change of opinion or feeling on the part of the non-slaveholding States of the Union in relation to this institution can justify them or their citizens in open or covert attacks thereon, with a view to its overthrow, and that all such attacks are in manifest violation of the mutual and solemn pledge to protect and defend each other, given by the States respectively on entering into the constitutional compact which formed the Union, and are a manifest breach of faith and a violation of the most solemn obligations. 3. Resolved, that the Union of these States rests on the equality of rights and privileges among its members, and that it is especially the duty of the Senate, which represents the States in their sovereign capacity, to resist all attempts to discriminate either in relation to persons or property in the territories which are the common possessions of the United States, so as to give advantages to the citizens of one State which are not equally assured to those of every other State. 4. Resolved, that neither Congress nor a territorial legislature, whether by direct legislation or legislation of an indirect and unfriendly character, possesses power to annul or impair the constitutional right of any citizen of the United States to take his slave property into the common territories, and there hold and enjoy the same while the territorial condition remains. 5. Resolved, that if experience should at any time prove that the judiciary and executive authority do not possess means to insure adequate protection to the constitutional rights in a territory, and if the territorial government shall fail or refuse to provide the necessary remedies for that purpose, it will be the duty of Congress to supply such deficiency. Footnote 14. The words "within the limits of its constitutional powers" were subsequently added to this resolution on the suggestion of Mr. Toombs, of Georgia, with the approval of the mover. 6. Resolved, that the inhabitants of a territory of the United States, when they rightfully form a constitution to be admitted as a state into the Union, may then, for the first time, like the people of a state when forming a new constitution, decide for themselves whether slavery as a domestic institution shall be maintained or prohibited within their jurisdiction, and they shall be received into the Union with or without slavery, as their constitution may prescribe at the time of their admission. 7. Resolved, that the provision of the Constitution for the rendition of fugitives from service or labor, without the adoption of which the Union could not have been formed, and that the laws of 1793 and 1850, which were enacted to secure its execution, and the main features of which, being similar, bear the impress of nearly 70 years of sanction by the highest judicial authority, should be honestly and faithfully observed and maintained by all who enjoy the benefits of our compact of union, and that all acts of individuals or of state legislatures to defeat the purpose or nullify the requirements of that provision, and the laws made in pursuance of it, are hostile in character, subversive of the Constitution, and revolutionary in their effect. Footnote 15. The speech of the author, delivered on the 7th of May ensuing, in exposition of these resolutions, will be found in Appendix F. After a protracted and earnest debate, these resolutions were adopted seriatim on the 24th and 25th of May by a decided majority of the Senate, varying from 33 to 36 yeas, against from 2 to 21 nays, the Democrats, both Northern and Southern, sustaining them unitedly, with the exception of one adverse vote, that of Mr. Pugh of Ohio, on the 4th and 6th resolutions. The Republicans all voted against them, or refrained from voting at all, except that Mr. Teniak of New Jersey voted for the 5th and 7th of the series. Mr. Douglas, the leader if not the author of Popular Sovereignty, was absent on account of illness, and there were a few other absentees. The conclusion of a speech in reply to Mr. Douglas, a few days before the vote was taken on these resolutions, is introduced here as the best evidence of the position of the author at that period of excitement and agitation. Conclusion of reply to Mr. Douglas, May 17, 1860. Mr. President, I briefly and reluctantly referred, because the subject had been introduced, to the attitude of Mississippi on a former occasion. I will now as briefly say that in 1851 and in 1860 Mississippi was and is ready to make every concession which it becomes her to make to the welfare and safety of the Union. If on the former occasion she hoped too much from fraternity, the responsibility for her disappointment rests upon those who failed to fulfill her expectations. She still clings to the government as her fathers formed it. She is ready today and tomorrow, as in her past, and though brief yet brilliant history, to maintain that government in all its power, and to vindicate its honor with all the means she possesses. I say brilliant history, for it is in the very morning of her existence that her sons, on the plains of New Orleans, were announced in general orders to have been the admiration of one army and the wonder of the other. That we had a division in relation to the measures enacted in 1850 is true; that the Southern rights men became the minority in the election which resulted is true; but no figure of speech could warrant the Senator in speaking of them as subdued, as coming to him or anybody else for quarter. I deemed it offensive when it was uttered, and the scorn with which I repelled it at the instant, time has only softened to contempt. Our flag was never borne from the field. We had carried it in the face of defeat, with a knowledge that defeat awaited it, but scarcely had the smoke of the battle passed away which proclaimed another victor, before the general voice admitted that the field again was ours. I have not seen a sagacious, reflecting man, who was cognizant of the events as they transpired at the time, who does not say that, within 2 weeks after the election, our party was in a majority, and the next election which occurred showed that we possessed the state beyond controversy. How we have wielded that power it is not for me to say. I trust others may see forbearance in our conduct, that with a determination to insist upon our constitutional rights, then and now, there is an unwavering desire to maintain the government and to uphold the Democratic party. We believe now, as we have asserted on former occasions, that the best hope for the perpetuity of our institutions depends on the cooperation, the harmony, the zealous action of the Democratic party. We cling to that party from conviction that its principles and its aims are those of truth and the country, as we cling to the Union for the fulfillment of the purposes for which it was formed. Whenever we shall be taught that the Democratic party is recreant to its principles, whenever we shall learn that it can not be relied upon to maintain the great measures which constitute its vitality, I, for one, shall be ready to leave it. And so, when we declare our tenacious adherence to the Union, it is the Union of the Constitution. If the compact between the States is to be trampled into the dust, if anarchy is to be substituted for the usurpation and consolidation which threatened the government at an earlier period, if the Union is to become powerless for the purposes for which it was established, and we are vainly to appeal to it for protection, then, sir, conscious of the rectitude of our course, the justice of our cause, self-reliant, yet humbly, confidingly, trusting in the arm that guided and protected our fathers, we look beyond the confines of the Union for the maintenance of our rights. An habitual reverence and cherished affection for the government will bind us to it longer than our interest would suggest or require. But he is a poor student of the world's history who does not understand that communities at last must yield to the dictates of their interests; that the affection, the mutual desire for the mutual good, which existed among our fathers, may be weakened in succeeding generations by the denial of right and hostile demonstration, until the equality guaranteed but not secured within the Union may be sought for without it, must be evident to even a careless observer of our race. It is time to be up and doing. There is yet time to remove the causes of dissension and alienation which are now distracting, and have for years past divided the country. If the Senator correctly described me as having at a former period, against my own preferences and opinions, acquiesced in the decision of my party; if when I had youth, when physical vigor gave promise of many days, and the future was painted in the colors of hope, I could thus surrender my own convictions, my own prejudices, and cooperate with my political friends according to their views of the best method of promoting the public good. Now, when the years of my future cannot be many, and experience has sobered the hopeful tints of youth's gilding, when, approaching the evening of life, the shadows are reversed, and the mind turns retrospectively, it is not to be supposed that I would abandon, lightly or idly put on trial, the party to which I have steadily adhered. It is rather to be assumed that conservatism, which belongs to the timidity or caution of increasing years, would lead me to cling to be supported by, rather than to cast off, the organization with which I have been so long connected. If I am driven to consider the necessity of separating myself from those old and dear relations, of discarding the accustomed support, under circumstances such as I have described, might not my friends who differ from me pause and inquire whether there is not something involved in it which calls for their careful revision? I desire no divided flag for the Democratic party. Our principles are national; they belong to every State of the Union, and though elections may be lost by their assertion, they constitute the only foundation on which we can maintain power, on which we can again rise to the dignity of the democracy once possessed. Does not the Senator from Illinois see in the sectional character of the vote he received that his opinions are not acceptable to every portion of the country? Footnote 16. In the Democratic Convention which had been recently held in Charleston. See the ensuing chapter. End footnote. Is not the fact that the resolutions adopted by 17 States, on which the greatest reliance must be placed for Democratic support, are in opposition to the dogma to which he still clings, a warning that, if he persists and succeeds in forcing his theory upon the Democratic party, its days are numbered? We ask only for the Constitution. We ask of the democracy only from time to time to declare, as current exigencies may indicate, what the Constitution was intended to secure and provide. Our flag bears no new device. Upon its folds our principles are written in living light, all proclaiming the constitutional union, justice, equality, and fraternity of our ocean-bound domain for a limitless future." End of chapter 6. Recording by Bill Moseley, Bernardo, Texas, USA.
The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sean Stipsky. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 7. A Retrospect. Growth of Sectional Rivalry. The Generosity of Virginia. Unequal accessions of territory. The tariffs and its effects. The Republican Convention of 1860, its resolutions and its nominations. The Democratic Convention at Charleston, its divisions and disruption. The nominations at Baltimore. The Constitutional Union Party and its nominees. An effort in behalf of agreement declined by Mr. Douglas. The election of Lincoln and Hamlin. Proceedings in the South. Evidences of calmness and deliberation. Mr. Buchanan's conservatism and the weakness of his position. Republican taunts. The New York Tribune, etc. When at the close of the War of the Revolution, each of the 13 colonies that had been engaged in that contest was severally acknowledged by the mother country, Great Britain, to be a free and independent state, the confederation of those states embraced an area so extensive, with climate and products so various, that rivalries and conflicts of interest soon began to be manifested. It required all the power of wisdom and patriotism, animated by the affection engendered by common sufferings and dangers, to keep these rivalries under restraint, and to effect those compromises which it was fondly hoped would ensure the harmony and mutual good offices of each for the benefit of all. It was in this spirit of patriotism and confidence in the continuance of such abiding good will as would for all time preclude hostile aggression that Virginia ceded, for the use of the Confederated States, all that vast extent of territory lying north of the Ohio River, out of which have since been formed 5 States and part of a 6th. The addition of these States has accrued entirely to the preponderance of the northern section over that from which the donation proceeded, and to the disturbance of that equilibrium which existed at the close of the War of the Revolution. It may not be out of place here to refer to the fact that the grievances which led to that war were directly inflicted upon the Northern colonies. Those of the South had no material cause of complaint, but, actuated by sympathy for their Northern brethren and a devotion to the principles of civil liberty and community independence, which they had inherited from their Anglo-Saxon ancestry, and which were set forth in the Declaration of Independence, they made common cause with their neighbors, and may, at least, claim to have done their full share in the war that ensued. By the exclusion of the South in 1820 from all that part of the Louisiana Purchase lying north of the parallel of 36 degrees 30 minutes, and not included in the State of Missouri, by the extension of that line of exclusion to embrace the territory acquired from Texas, and by the appropriation of all the territory obtained from Mexico under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, both north and south of that line, it may be stated with approximate accuracy that the North had monopolized to herself more than 3/4 of all that had been added to the domain of the United States since the Declaration of Independence. This inequality, which began, as has been shown, in the more generous than wise confidence of the South, was employed to obtain for the North the lion's share of what was afterward added at the cost of the public treasure and the blood of patriots. I do not care to estimate the relative proportion contributed by each of the 2 sections. Nor was this the only cause that operated to disappoint the reasonable hopes and to blight the fair prospects under which the original compact was formed. The effects of discriminating duties upon imports have been referred to in a former chapter, favoring the manufacturing region, which was the North, burdening the exporting region, which was the South, and so imposing upon the latter a double tax: one, by the increased price of articles of consumption, which, so far as they were of home production, went into the pockets of the manufacturer; the other, by the diminished value of articles of export, which was so much withheld from the pockets of the agriculturist. In like manner, the power of the majority section was employed to appropriate to itself an unequal share of the public disbursements. These combined causes, the possession of more territory, more money, and a wider field for the employment of special labor, all served to attract immigration, and, with increasing population, the greed grew by what it fed on. This became distinctly manifest when the so-called Republican Convention assembled in Chicago on May 16, 1860, to nominate a candidate for the presidency. It was a purely sectional body. There were a few delegates present, representing an insignificant minority in the border States, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, but not one from any State south of the celebrated political line of 36 degrees 30 minutes. It had been the invariable usage with nominating conventions of all parties to select candidates for the presidency and vice presidency, one from the North and the other from the South. But this assemblage nominated Mr. Lincoln of Illinois for the first office, and for the second Mr. Hamlin of Maine, both Northerners. Mr. Lincoln, its nominee for the presidency, had publicly announced that the Union could not permanently endure half slave and half free. The resolutions adopted contained some carefully worded declarations, well adapted to deceive the credulous who were opposed to hostile aggressions upon the rights of the States. In order to accomplish this purpose, they were compelled to create a fictitious issue, in denouncing what they described as the new dogma that the Constitution of its own force carries slavery into any or all of the territories of the United States, a dogma which had never been held or declared by anybody, and which had no existence outside of their own assertion. There was enough in connection with the nomination to assure the most fanatical foes of the Constitution that their ideas would be the rule and guide of the party. Meantime, the Democratic party had held a convention composed, as usual, of delegates from all the States. They met in Charleston, South Carolina, on April 23d, but an unfortunate disagreement with regard to the declaration of principles to be set forth rendered a nomination impracticable. Both divisions of the convention adjourned and met again in Baltimore in June. Then, having finally failed to come to an agreement, they separated and made their respective nominations apart. Mr. Douglas, of Illinois, was nominated by the friends of the doctrine of popular sovereignty, with Mr. Fitzpatrick, of Alabama, for the vice presidency. Both these gentlemen at that time were senators from their respective States. Mr. Fitzpatrick promptly declined the nomination, and his place was filled with the name of Mr. Herschel V. Johnson, a distinguished citizen of Georgia. The convention representing the conservative or state rights wing of the Democratic party, the president of which was the Honorable Caleb Cushing of Massachusetts, on the first ballot unanimously made choice of John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, then Vice President of the United States, for the first office, and, with like unanimity, selected General Joseph Lane, then a senator from Oregon, for the second. The resolutions of each of these two conventions denounced the action and policy of the abolition party as subversive of the Constitution and revolutionary in their tendency. Another convention was held in Baltimore about the same period by those who still adhered to the old Whig party, reinforced by the remains of the American organization and, perhaps, some others. This convention also consisted of delegates from all the States, and repudiating all geographical and sectional issues, and declaring it to be both the part of patriotism and of duty to recognize no political principle other than the Constitution of the country, the Union of the States, and the enforcement of the laws, pledged itself and its supporters to maintain, protect, and defend, separately and unitedly, those great principles of public liberty and national safety against all enemies at home and abroad. Its nominees were Messrs. John Bell, of Tennessee, and Edward Everett, of Massachusetts, both of whom had long been distinguished members of the Whig party. The people of the United States now had 4 rival tickets presented to them by as many contending parties, whose respective position and principles on the great and absorbing question at issue may be briefly recapitulated as follows. 1. The Constitutional Union Party, as it was now termed, led by Messrs. Bell and Everett, which ignored the territorial controversy altogether, and contented itself, as above stated, with a simple declaration of adherence to the Constitution, the Union, and the enforcement of the laws. 2. The party of popular sovereignty, headed by Douglas and Johnson, who affirmed the right of the people of the territories, in their territorial condition, to determine their own organic institutions, independently of the control of Congress, denying the power or duty of Congress to protect the persons or property of individuals or minorities in such territories against the action of majorities. 3. The state rights parties, supporting Breckinridge and Lane, who held that the territories were open to citizens of all the States, with their property, without any inequality or discrimination, and that it was the duty of the general government to protect both persons and property from aggression in the territories subject to its control. At the same time, they admitted and asserted the right of the people of a territory, on emerging from their territorial condition to that of a State, to determine what should then be their domestic institutions, as well as all other questions of personal or proprietary right, without interference by Congress, and subject only to the limitations and restrictions prescribed by the Constitution of the United States. 4. The so-called Republicans, presenting the names of Lincoln and Hamlin, who held, in the language of one of their leaders, that slavery can exist only by virtue of municipal law, that there was no law for it in the territories, and no power to enact one, and that Congress was bound to prohibit it in or exclude it from any and every federal territory. In other words, they asserted the right and duty of Congress to exclude the citizens of half the States of the Union from the territory belonging in common to all, unless on condition of the sacrifice or abandonment of their property recognized by the Constitution, indeed, of the only species of their property distinctly and specifically recognized as such by that instrument. On the vital question underlying the whole controversy, that is, whether the Federal Government should be a government of the whole for the benefit of all its equal members, or, if it should continue to exist at all, a sectional government for the benefit of a part, the first three of the parties above described were in substantial accord as against the fourth. If they could or would have acted unitedly, they could certainly have carried the election, and averted the catastrophe which followed. Nor were efforts wanting to effect such a union. Mr. Bell, the Whig candidate, was a highly respectable and experienced statesman, who had filled many important offices, both State and Federal. He was not ambitious to the extent of coveting the presidency, and he was profoundly impressed by the danger which threatened the country. Mr. Breckinridge had not anticipated, and, it may safely be said, did not eagerly desire the nomination. He was young enough to wait, and patriotic enough to be willing to do so, if the weal of the country required it. Thus much I may confidently assert of both those gentlemen, for each of them authorized me to say that he was willing to withdraw, if an arrangement could be effected by which the divided forces of the friends of the Constitution could be concentrated upon someone more generally acceptable than either of the three who had been presented to the country. When I made this announcement to Mr. Douglas, with whom my relations had always been such as to authorize the assurance that he could not consider it as made in an unfriendly spirit, he replied that the scheme proposed was impracticable, because his friends, mainly Northern Democrats, if he were withdrawn, would join in the support of Mr. Lincoln, rather than of any one that should supplant him, Douglas, that he was in the hands of his friends, and was sure they would not accept the proposition. It needed but little knowledge of the status of parties in the several States to foresee a probable defeat if the conservatives were to continue divided into three parts, and the aggressives were to be held in solid column. But angry passions, which are always bad counselors, had been aroused, and hopes were still cherished, which proved to be illusory. The result was the election by a minority of a President whose avowed principles were necessarily fatal to the harmony of the Union. Of 303 electoral votes, Mr. Lincoln received 180, but of the popular suffrage of 4,676,853 votes, which the electors represented, he obtained only 1,866,352, something over a third of the votes. This discrepancy was owing to the system of voting by general ticket, that is, casting the State votes as a unit, whether unanimous or nearly equally divided. Thus, in New York, the total popular vote was 675,156, of which 362,646 were cast for the so-called Republican or Lincoln electors, and 312,510 against them. New York was entitled to 35 electoral votes. Divided on the basis of popular vote, 19 of these would have been cast for Mr. Lincoln and 16 against him. But under the general ticket system, the entire 35 votes were cast for the Republican candidates, thus giving them not only the full strength of the majority in their favor, but that of the great minority against them superadded. So, of other Northern States, in which the small majorities on one side operated with the weight of entire unanimity, while the virtual unanimity in the Southern States on the other side counted nothing more than a mere majority would have done. The manifestations which followed this result in the Southern States did not proceed, as has been unjustly charged, from chagrin at their defeat in the election, or from any personal hostility to the President-elect, but from the fact that they recognized in him the representative of a party professing principles destructive to their peace, their prosperity, and their domestic tranquility. The long-suppressed fire burst into frequent flame, but it was still controlled by that love of the Union which the South had illustrated in every battlefield from Boston to New Orleans. Still, it was hoped against hope that some adjustment might be made to avert the calamities of a practical application of the theory of an irrepressible conflict. Few, if any, then doubted the right of a State to withdraw its grants delegated to the Federal Government, or, in other words, to secede from the Union; but in the South this was generally regarded as the remedy of last resort, to be applied only when ruin or dishonor was the alternative. No rash or revolutionary action was taken by the Southern States, but the measures adopted were considerate, and executed advisedly and deliberately. The presidential election occurred, as far as the popular vote, which determined the result, was concerned, in November, 1860. Most of the State legislatures convened soon afterward in regular session. In some cases, special sessions were convoked for the purpose of calling State conventions, the recognized representatives of the sovereign will of the people, to be elected expressly for the purpose of taking such action as should be considered needful and proper under the existing circumstances. These conventions, as it was always held and understood, possessed all the power of the people assembled in mass, and therefore it was conceded that they, and they only, could take action for the withdrawal of a State from the Union. The consent of the respective States to the formation of the Union had been given through such conventions, and it was only by the same authority that it could properly be revoked. The time required for this deliberate and formal process precludes the idea of hasty or passionate action, and none who admit the primary power of the people to govern themselves can consistently deny its validity and binding obligation upon every citizen of the several States. Not only was there ample time for calm consideration among the people of the South, but for due reflection by the General Government and the people of the Northern States. President Buchanan was in the last year of his administration. His freedom from sectional asperity, his long life in the public service, and his peace-loving and conciliatory character were all guarantees against his precipitating a conflict between the Federal Government and any of the States. But the feeble power that he possessed in the closing months of his term to mold the policy of the future was painfully evident. Like all who had intelligently and impartially studied the history of the formation of the Constitution, he held that the Federal Government had no rightful power to coerce a State. Like the sages and patriots who had preceded him in the high office that he filled, he believed that our Union rests upon public opinion, and can never be cemented by the blood of its citizens shed in civil war. If it cannot live in the affections of the people, it must one day perish. Congress may possess many means of preserving it by conciliation, but the sword was not placed in their hand to preserve it by force. Message of December 3, 1860. 10 years before, Mr. Calhoun, addressing the Senate with all the earnestness of his nature, and with that sincere desire to avert the danger of disunion, which those who knew him best never doubted, had asked the emphatic question, "How can the Union be saved?" He answered his question thus: "There is but one way which it can be saved with any certainty, and that is by a full and final settlement on the principles of justice of all the questions at issue between the sections. The South asks for justice, simple justice, and less she ought not to take. She has no compromise to offer but the Constitution, and no concession or surrender to make. Can this be done? Yes, easily. Not by the weaker party, for it can of itself do nothing, not even protect itself, but by the stronger. But will the North agree to do this? It is for her to answer this question. But I will say she cannot refuse if she has half the love of the Union which she professes to have, nor without exposing herself to the charge that her love of power and aggrandizement is far greater than her love of the Union." During the 10 years that intervened between the date of this speech and the message of Mr. Buchanan cited above, the progress of sectional discord and the tendency of the stronger section to unconstitutional aggression had been fearfully rapid. With very rare exceptions, there were none in 1850 who claimed the right of the Federal Government to apply coercion to a State. In 1860, men had grown to be familiar with threats of driving the South into submission to any act that the Government, in the hands of a Northern majority, might see fit to perform. During the canvass of that year, demonstrations had been made by quasi-military organizations in various parts of the North, which looked unmistakably to purposes widely different from those enunciated in the preamble to the Constitution, and to the employment of means not authorized by the powers which the States had delegated to the Federal Government. Well-informed men still remember that in the convention which framed the Constitution, a proposition was made to authorize the employment of force against a delinquent State, on which Mr. Madison remarked that the use of force against the State would look more like a declaration of war than an infliction of punishment, and would probably be considered by the party attacked as a dissolution of all previous compacts by which it might have been bound. The convention expressly refused to confer the power proposed, and the clause was lost. While, therefore, in 1860, many violent men, appealing to passion and the lust of power, were inciting the multitude and preparing Northern opinion to support a war waged against the Southern States in the event of their secession, there were others who took a different view of the case. Notable among such was the New York Tribune, which had been the organ of the abolitionists, and which now declared that if the Cotton States wished to withdraw from the Union, they should be allowed to do so; that any attempt to compel them to remain by force would be contrary to the principles of the Declaration of Independence and to the fundamental ideas upon which human liberty is based; and that if the Declaration of Independence justified the secession from the British Empire of 3 millions of subjects in 1776, it was not seen why it would not justify the secession of 5 millions of Southerners from the Union in 1861. Again, it was said by the same journal that sooner than compromise with the South and abandon the Chicago platform, they would let the Union slide. Taunting expressions were freely used, as, for example, "If the Southern people wish to leave the Union, we will do our best to forward their views." All this, it must be admitted, was quite consistent with the oft-repeated declaration that the Constitution was a "covenant with hell," which stood as the caption of a leading abolitionist paper of Boston. That signs of coming danger so visible, evidences of hostility so unmistakable, disregard of constitutional obligations so wanton, taunts and jeers so bitter and insulting, should serve to increase excitement in the South, was a consequence flowing as much from reason and patriotism as from sentiment. He must have been ignorant of human nature who did not expect such a tree to bear fruits of discord and division. End of Section 7. Recording by Sean Stipsky, Kingman, Arizona.
Section 8 of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 8. Conference with the Governor of Mississippi. The author censured as too slow. Summons to Washington. Interview with the President. His message. Movements in Congress. The triumphant majority. The Crittenden proposition. Speech of the author on Mr. Greene's resolution. The Committee of 13. Failure to agree. The Republicans responsible for the failure. Proceedings in the House of Representatives. Futility of efforts for an adjustment. The old year closes in clouds. In November 1860, after the result of the presidential election was known, the Governor of Mississippi, having issued his proclamation convoking a special session of the legislature to consider the propriety of calling a convention, invited the senators and representatives of the state in Congress to meet him for consultation as to the character of the message he should send to the legislature when assembled. While holding, in common with my political associates, that the right of a state to secede was unquestionable, I differed from most of them as to the probability of our being permitted peaceably to exercise the right. The knowledge acquired by the administration of the War Department for 4 years, and by the chairmanship of the Military Committee of the Senate at 2 different periods, still longer in combined duration, had shown me the entire lack of preparation for war in the South. The foundries and armories were in the Northern States, and there were stored all the new and improved weapons of war. In the arsenals of the Southern States were to be found only arms of the old and rejected models. The South had no manufactories of powder, and no navy to protect our harbors, no merchant ships for foreign commerce. It was evident to me, therefore, that, if we should be involved in war, the odds against us would be far greater than what was due merely to our inferiority in population. Believing that secession would be the precursor of war between the States, I was consequently slower and more reluctant than others, who entertained a different opinion, to resort to that remedy. While engaged in the consultation with the Governor just referred to, a telegraphic message was handed to me from 2 members of Mr. Buchanan's Cabinet, urging me to proceed immediately to Washington. This dispatch was laid before the Governor and the members of Congress from the State who were in conference with him, and it was decided that I should comply with the summons. I was afterward informed that my associates considered me too slow, and they were probably correct in the belief that I was behind the general opinion of the people of the State as to the propriety of prompt secession. Footnote: the following extract from a letter of the Hon. O.R. Singleton, then a representative of Mississippi in the United States Congress, in regard to the subject treated, is herewith annexed. Canton, Mississippi, July 14, 1877. In 1860, about the time the ordinance of secession was passed by the South Carolina Convention, and while Mississippi, Alabama, and other Southern States were making active preparations to follow her example, a conference of the Mississippi delegation in Congress, Senators, and Representatives was asked for by Governor J. J. Pettus for consultation as to the course Mississippi ought to take in the premises. The meeting took place in the fall of 1860 at Jackson, the capital, the whole delegation being present, with perhaps the exception of 1 representative. The main question for consideration was, shall Mississippi, as soon as her convention can meet, pass an ordinance of secession, thus placing herself by the side of South Carolina, regardless of the action of other States, or shall she endeavor to hold South Carolina in check, and delay action herself until other States can get ready, through their conventions, to unite with them, and then, on a given day and at a given hour, by concert of action, all the States willing to do so secede in a body. Upon the one side, it was argued that South Carolina could not be induced to delay action a single moment beyond the meeting of her convention, and that our fate should be hers, and to delay action would be to have her crushed by the Federal Government, whereas, by the earliest action possible, we might be able to avert this calamity. On the other side, it was contended that delay might bring the Federal Government to consider the emergency of the case, and perhaps a compromise could be effected. But, if not, then the proposed concert of action would at least give dignity to the movement, and present an undivided Southern front. The debate lasted many hours, and Mr. Davis, with perhaps 1 other gentleman in that conference, opposed immediate and separate State action, declaring himself opposed to secession as long as the hope of a peaceable remedy remained. He did not believe we ought to precipitate the issue, as he felt certain from his knowledge of the people, North and South, that once there was a clash of arms, the contest would be one of the most sanguinary the world had ever witnessed. A majority of the meeting decided that no delay should be interposed to separate State action, Mr. Davis being on the other side. But after the vote was taken and the question decided, Mr. Davis declared, he would stand by whatever action the convention representing the sovereignty of the State of Mississippi might think proper to take. After the conference was ended, several of its members were dissatisfied with the course of Mr. Davis, believing that he was entirely opposed to secession, and was seeking to delay action upon the part of Mississippi, with the hope that it might be entirely averted. In some unimportant respects, my memory may be at fault, and possibly some of the inferences drawn may be incorrect, but every material statement made, I am sure, is true, and if need can be, easily substantiated by other persons. Very respectfully yours, your obedient servant, (Signed) O.R. Singleton. On arrival at Washington, I found, as had been anticipated, that my presence there was desired on account of the influence which it was supposed I might exercise with the President, Mr. Buchanan, in relation to his forthcoming message to Congress. On paying my respects to the President, he told me that he had finished the rough draft of his message, but that it was still open to revision and amendment, and that he would like to read it to me. He did so, and very kindly accepted all the modifications which I suggested. The message was, however, afterwards somewhat changed, and, with great deference to the wisdom and statesmanship of its author, I must say that in my judgment the last alterations were unfortunate, so much so that, when it was read in the Senate, I was reluctantly constrained to criticize it. Compared, however, with the documents of the same class which have since been addressed to the Congress of the United States, the reader of presidential messages must regret that it was not accepted by Mr. Buchanan's successors as a model, and that his views of the Constitution had not been adopted as a guide in the subsequent action of the Federal Government. The popular movement in the South was tending steadily and rapidly toward the secession of those known as planting States, yet, when Congress assembled on December 3, 1860, the representatives of the people of all those States took their seats in the House, and they were all represented in the Senate, except South Carolina, whose senators had tendered their resignation to the Governor immediately on the announcement of the result of the presidential election. Hopes were still cherished that the Northern leaders would appreciate the impending peril, would cease to treat the warnings so often given as idle threats, would refrain from the bravado so often and so unwisely indulged of ability to whip the South in 30, 60, or 90 days, and would address themselves to the more manly purpose of devising means to allay the indignation and quiet the apprehensions, whether well-founded or not, of their Southern brethren. But the debates of the secession manifest, on the contrary, the arrogance of a triumphant party, and the determination to reap to the uttermost the full harvest of a party victory. Mr. Crittenden of Kentucky, the oldest and one of the most honored members of the Senate, introduced into that body a joint resolution proposing certain amendments to the Constitution, among them the restoration and incorporation into the Constitution of the geographical line of the Missouri Compromise, with other provisions, which it was hoped might be accepted as the basis for an adjustment of the difficulties rapidly hurrying the Union to disruption. Mr. Crittenden had been a lifelong Whig. His first entrance into the Senate was in 1817, and he was a member of that body at various periods during the ensuing 44 years. He was Attorney General in the Whig cabinets of both General Harrison and Mr. Fillmore, and supported the Bell and Everett ticket in 1860. But the earnest appeals of that venerable statesman were unheeded by senators of the so-called Republican party. Action upon his proposition was postponed from time to time, on one pretext or another, until the last day of the session, when 7 States had already withdrawn from the Union and established a confederation of their own, and it was then defeated by a majority of 1 vote. The vote was 19 yeas to 20 nays, total 31. As the consent of 2/3 of each House is necessary to propose an amendment for action by the States, 26 of the votes cast in the Senate would have been necessary to sustain the proposition. It actually failed, therefore, by 7 votes instead of 1. Meantime, among other propositions made in the Senate were 2 introduced early in the session, which it may be proper specially to mention. One of these was a resolution offered by Mr. Powell, of Kentucky, which, after some modification by amendment, when finally acted upon, had taken the following form: Resolved, that so much of the President's message as relates to the present agitated and distracted condition of the country and the grievances between the slaveholding and the non-slaveholding States be referred to a special committee of 13 members, and that said committee be instructed to inquire into the present condition of the country and report by bill or otherwise. The other was a resolution offered by Mr. Greene of Missouri to the following effect: Resolved, that the Committee on the Judiciary be instructed to inquire into the propriety of providing by law for establishing an armed police force at all necessary points along the line separating the slaveholding States from the non-slaveholding States, for the purpose of maintaining the general peace between those States, of preventing the invasion of one State by citizens of another, and also for the efficient execution of the fugitive slave laws. In the discussion of these 2 resolutions I find, in the proceedings of the Senate on December 10th, as reported in the Congressional Globe, some remarks of my own, the reproduction of which will serve to exhibit my position at that period, a position which has since been often misrepresented. Mr. President, if the political firmament seemed to me dark before, there has been little in the discussion this morning to cheer or illumine it. When the proposition of the Senator from Kentucky was presented, not very hopeful of a good result, I was yet willing to wait and see what developments it might produce. This morning for the first time it has been considered, and what of encouragement have we received? One Senator proposes, as a cure for the public evil impending over us, to invest the Federal Government with such physical power as properly belongs to monarchy alone. Another announces that his constituents cling to the Federal Government if its legislative favors and its treasury secure the works of improvement and the facilities which they desire, while another rises to point out that the evils of the land are of a party character. Sir, we have fallen upon evil times indeed, if the great convulsion which now shakes the body politic to its center is to be dealt with by such nostrums as these. Men must look more deeply, must rise to a higher altitude. Like patriots, they must confront the danger face to face, if they hope to relieve the evils which now disturb the peace of the land, and threaten the destruction of our political existence. First of all, we must inquire, what is the cause of the evils which beset us? The diagnosis of the disease must be stated before we are prepared to prescribe. Is it the fault of our legislation here? If so, then it devolves upon us to correct it, and we have the power. Is it the defect of the Federal organization, of the fundamental law of our Union? I hold that it is not. Our fathers, learning wisdom from the experiments of Rome and of Greece, the one a consolidated republic, and the other strictly a confederacy, and taught by the lessons of our own experiment under the Confederation, came together to form a constitution for a more perfect union, and, in my judgment, made the best government which has ever been instituted by man. It only requires that it should be carried out in the spirit in which it was made, that the circumstances under which it was made should continue, and no evil can arise under this government for which it has not an appropriate remedy. Then it is outside of the government, elsewhere than to its constitution or to its administration, that we are to look. Men must not creep in the dust of partisan strife and seek to make points against opponents as the means of evading or meeting the issues before us. The fault is not in the form of the government, nor does the evil spring from the manner in which it has been administered. Where then is it? It is that our fathers formed a government for a union of friendly states, and though under it the people have been prosperous beyond comparison with any other whose career is recorded in the history of man, still that union of friendly states has changed its character, and sectional hostility has been substituted for the fraternity in which the government was founded. I do not intend here to enter into a statement of grievances. I do not intend here to renew that war of crimination which for years past has disturbed the country, and in which I have taken a part perhaps more zealous than useful. But I call upon all men who have in their hearts a love of the Union, and whose service is not merely that of the lip, to look the question calmly but fully in the face, that they may see the true cause of our danger, which, from my examination, I believe to be that a sectional hostility has been substituted for a general fraternity, and thus the government rendered powerless for the ends for which it was instituted. The hearts of a portion of the people have been perverted by that hostility, so that the powers delegated by the compact of union are regarded not as means to secure the welfare of all, but as instruments for the destruction of a part, the minority section. How, then, have we to provide a remedy? By strengthening this government? By instituting physical force to overawe the states, to coerce the people living under them as members of sovereign communities to pass under the yoke of the Federal Government? No, sir. I would have this Union severed into 33 fragments sooner than have that great evil befall constitutional liberty and representative government. Our government is an agency of delegated and strictly limited powers. Its founders did not look to its preservation by force, but the chain they wove to bind these states together was one of love and mutual good offices. They had broken the fetters of despotic power. They had separated themselves from the mother country upon the question of community independence, and their sons will be degenerate indeed if, clinging to the mere name and forms of free government, they forge and rivet upon the posterity the fetters which their ancestors broke. The remedy for these evils is to be found in the patriotism and the affection of the people, if it exists, and, if it does not exist, it is far better, instead of attempting to preserve a forced and therefore fruitless union, that we should peacefully part, and each pursue his separate course. It is not to this side of the chamber that we should look for propositions. It is not here that we can ask for remedies. Complaints, with much amplitude of specification, have gone forth from the members on this side of the chamber heretofore. It is not to be expected that they will be renewed, for the people have taken the subject into their own hands. States, in their sovereign capacity, have now resolved to judge the infractions of the Federal compact, and of the mode and measure of redress. All we can usefully or properly do is to send to the people, thus preparing to act for themselves, evidence of error, if error there be, to transmit to them the proofs of kind feeling, if it actuates the northern section, where they now believe there is only hostility. If we are mistaken as to your feelings and purposes, give a substantial proof, that here may begin that circle which hence may spread out and cover the whole land with the proofs of fraternity, of a reaction in public sentiment, and the assurance of a future career in conformity with the principles and purposes of the Constitution. All else is idle. I would not give the parchment on which the bill would be written, that is to secure our constitutional rights within the limits of a State, where the people are all opposed to the execution of that law. It is a truism in free governments that laws rest upon public opinion, and fall powerless before its determined opposition. The time has passed, sir, when appeals might profitably be made to sentiment. The time has come when men must of necessity reason, assemble facts, and deal with current events. I may be permitted in this to correct an error into which one of my friends fell this morning, when he impressed on us the great value of our Union as measured by the amount of time and money and blood which were spent to form this Union. It cost very little time, very little money, and no blood. It was one of the most peaceful transactions that mark the pages of human history. Our fathers fought the war of the Revolution to maintain the rights asserted in their Declaration of Independence. Mr. Powell: The Senator from Mississippi will allow me to say that I spoke of the Government, not of the Union. I said time and money and blood had been required to form the Government. Mr. Davis: The Government is the machinery established by the Constitution. It is the agency created by the States when they formed the Union. Our fathers, I was proceeding to say, have fought the war of the Revolution and achieved their independence, each State for itself, each State standing out an integral part, each State separately recognized by the parent government of Great Britain. These States as independent sovereignties entered in Confederate alliance. After having tried the Confederation and found it to be a failure, they of their own accord came peacefully together and in a brief period made a Constitution, which was referred to each State and voluntarily ratified by each State that entered the Union, little time, little money, and no blood being expended to form this government, the machine for making the Union useful and beneficial. Blood, much and precious, was expended to vindicate and to establish community independence, and the great American idea that all governments rest on the consent of the governed, and that the people may at their will alter or abolish their government, however or by whomsoever instituted. But our existing government is not the less sacred to me because it was not sealed with blood. I honor it the more because it was the free will offering of men who chose to live together. It rooted in fraternity, and fraternity supported its trunk and all its branches. Every bud and leaflet depends entirely on the nurture it receives from fraternity as the root of the tree. When that is destroyed, the trunk decays, and the branches wither, and the leaves fall, and the shade it was designed to give has passed away forever. I cling not merely to the name and form, but to the spirit and purpose of the Union which our fathers made. It was for domestic tranquillity, not to organize within one State lawless bands to commit raids upon another. It was to provide for the common defense, not to disband armies and navies, lest they should serve the protection of one section of the country better than another. It was to bring the forces of all the States together to achieve a common object, upholding each the other in amity, and united to repel exterior force. All the custom house obstructions existing between the States were destroyed, the power to regulate commerce transferred to the general government. Every barrier to the freest intercourse was swept away. Under the Confederation it had been secured as a right to each citizen to have free transit over all the other States, and under the Union it was designed to make this more perfect. Is it enjoyed? Is it not denied? Do we not have mere speculative question of what is property raised in defiance of the clear intent of the Constitution, offending as well against its letter as against its whole spirit? This must be reformed, or the government our fathers instituted is destroyed. I say then, shall we cling to the mere forms, or idolize the name of Union, when its blessings are lost after its spirit has fled? Who would keep a flower which had lost its beauty and its fragrance, and in their stead had formed a seed vessel containing the deadliest poison? Or, to drop the figure, who would consent to remain in alliance with States which used the power thus acquired to invade his tranquillity, to impair his defense, to destroy his peace and security? Any community would be stronger standing in an isolated position and using its revenues to maintain its own physical force than if allied with those who would thus war upon its prosperity and domestic peace, and reason, pride, self-interest, and the apprehension of secret, constant danger would impel to separation. I do not comprehend the policy of a Southern senator who would seek to change the whole form of our government and substitute federal force for state obligation and authority. Do we want a new government that is to overthrow the old? Do we wish to erect a central colossus, wielding at discretion the military arm, and exercising military force over the people and the states? This is not the Union to which we were invited, and so carefully was this guarded, that, when our fathers, providing for using force, put down insurrection, they required that the fact of the insurrection should be communicated by the authorities of the State before the President could interpose. When it was proposed to give to Congress power to execute the laws against a delinquent State, it was refused, on the ground that that would be making war on the States. And, though I know the good purpose of my honorable friend from Missouri is only to give protection to constitutional rights, I fear his proposition is to rear a monster which will break the feeble chain provided, and destroy rights it was intended to guard. That military government which he is about to institute, by passing into hostile hands, becomes a weapon for his destruction, not for his protection. All dangers which we may be called upon to confront as independent communities are light, in my estimation, compared with that which would hang over us if this Federal Government had such physical force, if its character was changed from a representative agency of States to a central government, with a military power to be used at discretion against the States. Today it may be the idea that it will be used against some State which nullifies the Constitution and the laws, some State which passes laws to obstruct or repeal the laws of the United States, some State which, in derogation of our rights of transit under the Constitution, passes laws to punish a citizen found there with property recognized by the Constitution of the United States, but prohibited by the laws of that State. But how long might it be before that same military force would be turned against the minority section which had sought its protection, and that minority thus become mere subjugated provinces under the great military government that it had thus contributed to establish? The minority, incapable of aggression, is, of necessity, always on the defensive, and often the victim of the desertion of its followers and the faithlessness of its allies. It therefore must maintain, not destroy, barriers. I do not know that I fully appreciate the purpose of my friend from Missouri, whether, when he spoke of establishing military posts along the borders of the States, and arming the Federal Government with adequate physical power to enforce constitutional rights, I suppose he meant obligations. He meant to confer upon the Federal Government a power which it does not now possess to coerce a State. If he did, then in the language of Mr. Madison, he is providing, not for a union of States, but for the destruction of States. He is providing, under the name of Union, to carry on a war against States, and I care not whether it be against Massachusetts or Missouri. It is equally objectionable to me, and I will resist it alike in the one case and in the other, as subversive of the great principle on which our government rests, as a heresy to be confronted at its first presentation and put down there lest it grow into proportions which will render us powerless before it. The theory of our Constitution, Mr. President, is one of peace, of equality of sovereign States. It was made by States and made for States, and for greater assurance they passed an amendment doing that which was necessarily implied by the nature of the instrument, as it was a mere instrument of grants. But, in the abundance of caution, they declared that everything which had not been delegated was reserved to the States or to the people, that is, to the State governments as instituted by the people of each State, or to the people in their sovereign capacity. I need not, then, go on to argue from the history and nature of our government that no power of coercion exists in it. It is enough for me to demand the clause of the Constitution which confers the power. If it is not there, the government does not possess it. That is the plain construction of the Constitution, made plainer, if possible, by its amendment. This Union is dear to me as a union of fraternal states. It would lose its value if I had to regard it as a union held together by physical force. I would be happy to know that every State now felt that fraternity which made this union possible, and if that evidence could go out, if evidence satisfactory to the people of the South could be given that that feeling existed in the hearts of the Northern people, you might burn your statute books, and we would cling to the Union still. But it is because of their conviction that hostility and not fraternity now exists in the heart of the people, that they are looking to their reserved rights and to their independent powers for their own protection. If there be any good, then, which we can do, it is by sending evidence to them of that which I fear does not exist, the purpose of your constituents to fulfill in the spirit of justice and fraternity all their constitutional obligations. If you can submit to them that evidence, I feel confidence that, with the assurance that aggression is henceforth to cease, will terminate all the measures for defense. Upon you of the majority section it depends to restore peace and perpetuate the union of equal States. Upon us of the minority section rests the duty to maintain our equality and community rights, and the means in one case or the other must be such as each can control. The resolution of Mr. Powell was eventually adopted on the 18th of December, and on the 20th the committee was appointed, consisting of Messrs. Powell and Crittenden of Kentucky, Hunter of Virginia, Toombs of Georgia, Davis of Mississippi, Douglas of Illinois, Bigler of Pennsylvania, Rice of Minnesota, Collamer of Vermont, Seward of New York, Wade of Ohio, Doolittle of Wisconsin, and Grimes of Iowa. The first 5 of the list, as here enumerated, were Southern men. The next 3 were Northern Democrats, or Conservatives, the last 5 Northern Republicans, so called. The supposition was that any measure agreed upon by the representatives of the 3 principal divisions of public opinion would be approved by the Senate and afterward ratified by the House of Representatives. The committee therefore determined that a majority of each of its 3 divisions should be required in order to the adoption of any proposition presented. The Southern members declared their readiness to accept any terms that would secure the honor of the Southern States and guarantee their future safety. The Northern Democrats and Mr. Crittenden generally cooperated with the State Rights Democrats of the South, but the so-called Republican senators of the North rejected every proposition which it was hoped might satisfy the Southern people, and check the progress of the secession movement. After fruitless efforts, continued for some 10 days, the committee determined to report the journal of their proceedings and announce their inability to attain any satisfactory conclusion. This report was made on the 31st of December, the last day of that memorable and fateful year, 1860. Subsequently, on the floor of the Senate, Mr. Douglas, who had been a member of the committee, called upon the opposite side to state what they were willing to do. He referred to the fact that they had rejected every proposition that promised pacification, stated that Toombs of Georgia and Davis of Mississippi, as members of the committee, had been willing to renew the Missouri Compromise as a measure of conciliation, but had met no responsive willingness on the part of their associates of the opposition, and he pressed the point that as they had rejected every overture made by the friends of peace, it was now incumbent upon them to make a positive and affirmative declaration of their purposes. Mr. Seward of New York, as we have seen, was a member of that committee, the man who, in 1858, had announced the irrepressible conflict, and who, in the same year, speaking of and for abolitionism, had said, "It has driven you back in California and in Kansas. It will invade your soil." He was to be the Secretary of State in the incoming administration, and was very generally regarded as the power behind the throne, greater than the throne itself. He was present in the Senate, but made no response to Mr. Douglas's demand for a declaration of policy. Meantime, the efforts for an adjustment made in the House of Representatives had been equally fruitless. Conspicuous among these efforts had been the appointment of a committee of 33 members, one from each State of the Union, charged with a duty similar to that imposed upon the committee of 13 in the Senate, but they had been alike unsuccessful in coming to any agreement. It is true that a few days afterward they submitted a majority and 2 minority reports, and that the report of the majority was ultimately adopted by the House. But even if this action had been unanimous and had been taken in due time, it would have been practically futile on account of its absolute failure to provide or suggest any solution of the territorial question, which was the vital point in controversy. No wonder, then, that under the shadow of the failure of every effort in Congress to find any common ground on which the sections could be restored to amity, the close of the year should have been darkened by a cloud in the firmament, which had lost even the silver lining so long seen, or thought to be seen, by the hopeful. End of chapter 8. Of the Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 9. Preparations for Withdrawal from the Union, Northern Precedents, New England Secessionists, Cabot, Pickering, Quincy, etc., on the Acquisition of Louisiana, the Hartford Convention, the Massachusetts Legislature on the Annexation of Texas, etc., etc. The Convention of South Carolina had already, on the 20th of December, 1860, unanimously adopted an ordinance revoking her delegated powers and withdrawing from the Union. Her representatives, on the following day, retired from their seats in Congress. The people of the other planting States had been only waiting in the lingering hope that some action might be taken by Congress to avert the necessity for action similar to that of South Carolina. In view of the failure of all overtures for conciliation during the first month of the session, they were now making their final preparations for secession. This was generally admitted to be an unquestionable right appertaining to their sovereignty as States, and the only peaceable remedy that remained for the evils already felt and the dangers apprehended. In the prior history of the country, repeated instances are found of the assertion of this right, and of a purpose entertained at various times to put it in execution. Notably is this true of Massachusetts and other New England States. The acquisition of Louisiana in 1803 had created much dissatisfaction in those States for the reason expressed by an eminent citizen of Massachusetts. George Cabot, who had been United States Senator from Massachusetts for several years during the administration of Washington. See Life of Cabot by Lodge, page 334.] that the influence of our northeastern part of the Union must be diminished by the acquisition of more weight at the other extremity. The project of a separation was freely discussed, with no intimation in the records of the period of any idea among its advocates that it could be regarded as treasonable or revolutionary. Colonel Timothy Pickering, who had been an officer of the War of the Revolution, afterward successively Postmaster General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State in the Cabinet of General Washington, and still later long a representative of the State of Massachusetts in the Senate of the United States, was one of the leading secessionists of his day. Writing from Washington to a friend on the 24th of December, 1803, he says, "I will not yet despair. I will rather anticipate a new Confederacy exempt from the corruption and corrupting influence and oppression of the aristocratic Democrats of the South. There will be, and our children at farthest will see it, a separation. The white and black population will mark the boundary." In another letter written a few weeks afterward, January 29, 1804, speaking of what he regarded as wrongs and abuses perpetrated by the then existing administration, he thus expresses his views of the remedy to be applied: "The principles of our Revolution point to the remedy, a separation. That this can be accomplished, and without spilling one drop of blood, I have little doubt. I do not believe in the practicability of a long continued Union. A Northern Confederacy would unite congenial characters and present a fairer prospect of public happiness, while the Southern States, having a similarity of habits, might be left to manage their own affairs in their own way. If a separation were to take place, our mutual wants would render a friendly and commercial intercourse inevitable. The Southern States would require the naval protection of the Northern Union, and the products of the former would be important to the navigation and commerce of the latter. The separation, must begin in Massachusetts. The proposition would be welcomed in Connecticut, and could we doubt of New Hampshire? But New York must be associated, and how is her concurrence to be obtained? She must be made the center of the Confederacy. Vermont and New Jersey would follow of course, and Rhode Island of necessity. Substituting South Carolina for Massachusetts, Virginia for New York, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama for New Hampshire, Vermont, and Rhode Island, Kentucky for New Jersey, etc., etc., we find the suggestions of 1860 to 61 only a reproduction of those thus outlined nearly 60 years earlier. Mr. Pickering seems to have had a correct and intelligent perception of the altogether pacific character of the secession which he proposed, and of the mutual advantages likely to accrue to both sections from a peaceable separation. Writing in February, 1804, he explicitly disavows the idea of hostile feeling or action toward the South, expressing himself as follows: "While thus contemplating the only means of maintaining our ancient institutions in morals and religion, and our equal rights, we wish no ill to the Southern States and those naturally connected with them. The public debts might be equitably apportioned between the new confederacies, and a separation somewhere about the line above suggested would divide the different characters of the existing Union. The manners of the eastern portion of the States would be sufficiently congenial to form a Union, and their interests are alike intimately connected with agriculture and commerce. A friendly and commercial intercourse would be maintained with the States in the Southern Confederacy as at present. Thus all the advantages which have been for a few years depending on the general Union would be continued to its respective portions, without the jealousies and enmities which now afflict both, and which peculiarly embitter the condition of that of the North. It is not unusual for two friends, when disagreeing about the mode of conducting a common concern, to separate and manage, each in his own way, his separate interest, and thereby preserve a useful friendship, which without such a separation would infallibly be destroyed. Such were the views of an undoubted patriot who had participated in the formation of the Union, and who had long been confidentially associated with Washington in the administration of its government, looking at the subject from a Northern standpoint within 15 years after the organization of that government under the Constitution. Whether his reasons for advocating a dissolution of the Union were valid and sufficient or not, is another question which it is not necessary to discuss. His authority is cited only as showing the opinion prevailing in the North at that day with regard to the right of secession from the Union, if deemed advisable by the ultimate and irreversible judgment of the people of a sovereign State. In 1811, on the bill for the admission of Louisiana as a State of the Union, the Hon. Josiah Quincy, a member of Congress from Massachusetts, said, "If this bill passes, it is my deliberate opinion that it is virtually a dissolution of this Union, that it will free the States from their moral obligation, and, as it will be the right of all, so it will be the duty of some, definitely to prepare for a separation, amicably if they can, violently if they must." Mr. Poindexter, delegate from what was then the Mississippi Territory, took exception to these expressions of Mr. Quincy, and called him to order. The Speaker, Mr. Varnum of Massachusetts, sustained Mr. Poindexter, and decided that the suggestion of a dissolution of the Union was out of order. An appeal was taken from this decision, and it was reversed. Mr. Quincy proceeded to vindicate the propriety of his position in a speech of some length, in the course of which he said, "Is there a principle of public law better settled or more comfortable to the plainest suggestions of reason than that the violation of a contract by one of the parties may be considered as exempting the other from his obligations? Suppose in private life 13 form a partnership, and 10 of them undertake to admit a new partner without the concurrence of the other 3. Would it not be at their option to abandon the partnership after so palpable an infringement of their rights? How much more in the political partnership, where the admission of new associates without previous authority is so pregnant with obvious dangers and evils?" It is to be remembered that these men, Cabot, Pickering, Quincy, and others, whose opinions and expressions have been cited, were not Democrats, misled by extreme theories of State rights, but leaders and expositors of the highest type of Federalism and of a strong central government. This fact gives their support of the right of secession the greater significance. The celebrated Hartford Convention assembled in December, 1814. It consisted of delegates chosen by the legislatures of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, with an irregular or imperfect representation from the other 2 New England States, New Hampshire and Vermont. Footnote: Maine was not then a State. End footnote. Convened for the purpose of considering the grievances complained of by those States in connection with the war with Great Britain. They sat with closed doors, and the character of their deliberations and discussions has not been authentically disclosed. It was generally understood, however, that the chief subject of their considerations was the question of the withdrawal of the States they represented from the Union. The decision, as announced in their published report, was adverse to the expediency of such a measure at that time, and under the then existing conditions, but they proceeded to indicate the circumstances in which a dissolution of the Union might become expedient, and the mode in which it should be effected. and their theoretical plan of separation corresponds very nearly with that actually adopted by the Southern States nearly 50 years afterward. They say, "If the Union can be destined to dissolution by reason of the multiplied abuses of bad administration, it should, if possible, be the work of peaceable times and deliberate consent. Some new form of confederacy should be substituted among those States which shall intend to maintain a federal relation to each other. Events may prove that the causes of our calamities are deep and permanent. They may be found to proceed not merely from the blindness of prejudice, pride of opinion, violence of party spirit, or the confusion of the times, but they may be traced to implacable combinations of individuals or of States to monopolize power and office, and to trample without remorse upon the rights and interests of commercial sections of the Union. Whenever it shall appear that the causes are radical and permanent, a separation by equitable arrangement will be preferable to an alliance by constraint among nominal friends, but real enemies." The omission of the single word "commercial," which does not affect the principle involved, is the only modification necessary to adapt this extract exactly to the condition of the Southern States in 1860 61. The obloquy which has attached to the members of the Hartford Convention has resulted partly from a want of exact knowledge of their proceedings, partly from the secrecy by which they were veiled, but mainly because it was a recognized effort to paralyze the arm of the Federal Government while engaged in a war arising from outrages committed upon American seamen on the decks of American ships. The indignation felt was no doubt aggravated by the fact that those ships belonged in a great extent to the people who were now plotting against the war measures of the Government, and indirectly, if not directly, giving aid and comfort to the public enemy. Time, which has mollified passion and revealed many things not then known, has largely modified the first judgment passed on the proceedings and purposes of the Hartford Convention, and, but for the circumstances of existing war which surrounded it, they might have been viewed as political opinions merely, and have received justification instead of censure. Again, in 1844 45, the measures taken for the annexation of Texas evoked remonstrances, accompanied by threats of a dissolution of the Union from the northeastern States. The legislature of Massachusetts, in 1844, adopted a resolution declaring in behalf of that State that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, faithful to the compact between the people of the United States, according to the plain meaning and intent in which it was understood by them, is sincerely anxious for its preservation, but that it is determined, as it doubts not the other States are, to submit to undelegated powers in no body of men on earth, and that the project of the annexation of Texas, unless arrested on the threshold, may tend to drive these States into a dissolution of the Union. Early in the next year, February 11, 1845, the same legislature adopted and communicated to Congress a series of resolutions on the same subject, in one of which it was declared that, as the powers of legislation granted in the Constitution of the United States to Congress do not embrace a case of the admission of a foreign State or foreign territory by legislation into the Union, such an act of admission would have no binding force whatever on the people of Massachusetts, language which must have meant that the admission of Texas would be a justifiable ground for secession, unless it was intended to announce the purpose of nullification. It is evident, therefore, that the people of the South, in the crisis which confronted them in 1860, had no lack either of precept or of precedent for their instruction and guidance in the teaching and the example of our brethren of the North and East. The only practical difference was that the North threatened and the South acted. End of chapter 9. Section 10 of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 10. False statements of the grounds for separation. Slavery not the cause, but an incident. The Southern people not propagandists of slavery. Early accord among the States with regard to African servitude. Statement of the Supreme Court. Guarantees of the Constitution. Disregard of oaths. Fugitives from service and the personal liberty laws. Equality in the territories the paramount question. The Dred Scott case. Disregard of the decision of the Supreme Court. Culmination of wrongs. Despair of their redress. Triumph of sectionalism. At the period to which this review of events has advanced, one state had already withdrawn from the Union. 7 or 8 others were preparing to follow her example, and others yet were anxiously and doubtfully contemplating the probably impending necessity of taking the same action. The efforts of Southern men in Congress, aided by the cooperation of the Northern friends of the Constitution, had failed, by the stubborn refusal of a haughty majority, controlled by radical purposes, to yield anything to the spirit of peace and conciliation. This period, coinciding, as it happens, with the close of a calendar year, affords a convenient point to pause for a brief recapitulation of the causes which had led the Southern States into the attitude they then held, and for a more full exposition of the constitutional questions involved. The reader of many of the treatises on these events, which have been put forth as historical, if dependent upon such alone for information, might naturally enough be led to the conclusion that the controversies which arose between the States and the war in which they culminated were caused by efforts on the one side to extend and perpetuate human slavery, and on the other to resist it and establish human liberty. The Southern States and the Southern people have been sedulously represented as propagandists of slavery, and the Northern as the defenders and champions of universal freedom, and this view has been so arrogantly assumed, so dogmatically asserted, and so persistently reiterated, that its authors have, in many cases, perhaps, succeeded in bringing themselves to believe it, as well as in impressing it widely upon the world. The attentive reader of the preceding chapters, especially if he has compared their statements with contemporaneous records and other original sources of information, will already have found evidence enough to enable him to discern the falsehood of these representations, and to perceive that, to whatever extent the question of slavery may have served as an occasion, it was far from being the cause of the conflict. I have not attempted, and shall not permit myself to be drawn into any discussion of the merits or demerits of slavery as an ethical or even as a political question. It would be foreign to my purpose, irrelevant to my subject, and would only serve, as it has invariably served in the hands of its agitators, to darken counsel and divert attention from the genuine issues involved. As a mere historical fact, we have seen that African servitude among us, confessedly the mildest and most humane of all institutions to which the name slavery has ever been applied, existed in all the original States, and that it was recognized and protected in the 4th article of the Constitution. Subsequently, for climatic, industrial, and economical, not moral or sentimental, reasons, it was abolished in the Northern, while it continued to exist in the Southern States. men differed in their views as to the abstract question of its right or wrong, but for 2 generations after the Revolution there was no geographical line of demarcation for such differences. The African slave trade was carried on almost exclusively by New England merchants and Northern ships. Mr. Jefferson, a Southern man, the founder of the Democratic Party, and the vindicator of state rights, was in theory a consistent enemy to every form of slavery. The Southern states took the lead in prohibiting the slave trade, and, as we have seen, one of them, Georgia, was the first state to incorporate such a prohibition in her organic constitution. 11 years after the agitation on the Missouri question, when the subject first took a sectional shape, the abolition of slavery was proposed and earnestly debated in the Virginia legislature, and its advocates were so near the accomplishment of their purpose that a declaration in its favor was defeated only by a small majority, and that on the ground of expediency. At a still later period, abolitionist lecturers and teachers were mobbed, assaulted, and threatened with tar and feathers in New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and other states. One of them, Lovejoy, was actually killed by a mob in Illinois as late as 1837. These facts prove incontestably that the sectional hostility which exhibited itself in 1820 on the application of Missouri for admission into the Union, which again broke out on the proposition for the annexation of Texas in 1844, and which reappeared after the Mexican War, never again to be suppressed until its fell results had been fully accomplished, was not the consequence of any difference on the abstract question of slavery. It was the offspring of sectional rivalry and political ambition. It would have manifested itself just as certainly if slavery had existed in all the states, or if there had not been a Negro in America. No such pretension was made in 1803 or 1811, when the Louisiana Purchase, and afterward the admission into the Union of the State of that name, elicited threats of disunion from the representatives of New England. The complaint was not of slavery, but of the acquisition of more weight at the other extremity of the Union. It was not slavery that threatened a rupture in 1832, but the unjust and unequal operation of a protective tariff. It happened, however, on all these occasions, that the line of demarcation of sectional interests coincided exactly, or very nearly, with that dividing the states in which Negro servitude existed from those in which it had been abolished. It corresponded with a prediction of Mr. Pickering in 1803 that, in the separation certainly to come, the white and black population would mark the boundary, a prediction made without any reference to slavery as a source of dissension. Of course, the diversity of institutions contributed, in some minor degree, to the conflict of interests. There is an action and reaction of cause and consequence which limits and modifies any general statement of a political truth. I am stating general principles, not defining modifications and exceptions with the precision of a mathematical proposition or a bill in Chancery. The truth remains intact and incontrovertible, that the existence of African servitude was in no wise the cause of the conflict, but only an incident. In the later controversies that arose, however, its effect in operating as a lever upon the passions, prejudices, or sympathies of mankind was so potent that it had been spread like a thick cloud over the whole horizon of historic truth. As for the institution of Negro servitude, it was a matter entirely subject to the control of the States. No power was ever given to the general government to interfere with it, but an obligation was imposed to protect it. Its existence and validity were distinctly recognized by the Constitution in at least 3 places. First, in that part of the second section of the first article which prescribes that, "representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several States which may be included within this Union, according to their respective members, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." Other persons than free persons and those bound to service for a term of years must of course have meant those permanently bound to service. Secondly, it was recognized by the 9th section of the same article, which provided that "the migration or importation of such persons as any of the States now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808." This was a provision inserted for the protection of the interests of the slave trading New England States, forbidding any prohibition of the trade by Congress for 20 years, and thus virtually giving sanction to the legitimacy of the demand which that trade was prosecuted to supply, and which was its only object. Again, and in the third place, it was specially recognized, and an obligation imposed upon every State, not only to refrain from interfering with it in any other State, but in certain cases to aid in its enforcement, by that clause or paragraph of the 2nd section of the 4th article, which provides as follows: "No person held to service or labor in one State, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." The President and Vice President of the United States, every Senator and Representative in Congress, the members of every State Legislature, and all executive and judicial officers both of the United States and of the several States, were required to take an oath, or affirmation, to support the Constitution containing these provisions. It is easy to understand how those who considered them in conflict with a higher law of religion or morality might refuse to take such an oath, or hold such an office, as the members of some religious sects refuse to take any oath at all, or to bear arms in the service of their country. But it is impossible to reconcile with the obligations of honor or honesty the conduct of those who, having taken such an oath, made use of the powers and opportunities of the offices held under its sanctions to nullify its obligations and neutralize its guarantees. The halls of Congress afforded the vantage ground from which assaults were made upon these guarantees. The legislatures of various Northern States enacted laws to hinder the execution of the provisions made for the rendition of fugitives from service. State officials lent their aid to the work of thwarting them, and city mobs assailed the officers engaged in the duty of enforcing them. With regard to the provision of the Constitution above quoted for the restoration of fugitives from service or labor, my own view was, and is, that it was not a proper subject for legislation by the Federal Congress, but that its enforcement should have been left to the respective States, which, as parties to the compact of union, should have been held accountable for its fulfillment. Such was actually the case in the earlier and better days of the Republic. No fugitive slave law existed, or was required, for 2 years after the organization of the Federal Government, and when one was then passed, it was merely as an incidental appendage to an act regulating the mode of rendition of fugitives from justice, not from service or labor. Footnote: There was but little necessity in those times, nor long after, for an act of Congress to authorize the recovery of fugitive slaves. The laws of the free States, and still more, the force of public opinion, were the owner's best safeguards. Public opinion was against the abduction of slaves, and if any one was seduced from his owner, it was done furtively and secretly, without show of force, and as any other moral offense would be committed. State laws favored the owner, and to a greater extent than the act of Congress did or could. In Pennsylvania there was an act, it was passed in 1780 and only repealed in 1847, discriminating between the traveler and sojourner and the permanent resident, allowing the former to remain 6 months in the state before his slaves would become subject to the emancipation laws, and, in the case of a Federal officer, allowing as much more time as his duties required him to remain. New York had the same act, only varying in time, which was 9 months. While these two acts were in force and supported by public opinion, the traveler and sojourner was safe with his slaves in those states, and the same in the other free states. There was no trouble about fugitive slaves in those times. Note to Benton's Abridgment of Debates, Volume 1, page 417. End of footnote. In 1850, a more elaborate law was enacted as part of the celebrated compromise of that year. But the very fact that the Federal Government had taken the matter into its own hands and provided for its execution by its own officers afforded a sort of pretext to those states which had now become hostile to the provision of the Constitution, not only to stand aloof, but in some cases to adopt measures, generally known as personal liberty laws, directly in conflict with the execution of the provisions of the Constitution. The preamble to the Constitution declared the object of its founders to be, "to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquillity, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." Now, however, in 1860, the people of a portion of the States had assumed an attitude of avowed hostility, not only to the provisions of the Constitution itself, but to the domestic tranquillity of the people of other States. Long before the formation of the Constitution, one of the charges preferred in the Declaration of Independence against the government of Great Britain as justifying the separation of the colonies from that country was that of having excited domestic insurrections among us. Now the mails were burdened with incendiary publications, secret emissaries had been sent, and in one case an armed invasion of one of the States had taken place for the very purpose of exciting domestic insurrection. It was not the passage of the personal liberty laws. It was not the circulation of incendiary documents. It was not the raid of John Brown. It was not the operation of unjust and unequal tariff laws, nor all combined, that constituted the intolerable grievance, but it was the systematic and persistent struggle to deprive the Southern States of equality in the Union, generally to discriminate in legislation against the interests of their people, culminating in their exclusion from the territories, the common properties of the States, as well as by the infraction of their compact to promote domestic tranquillity. The question with regard to the territories has been discussed in the foregoing chapters, and the argument need not be repeated. There was, however, one feature of it which has not been specially noted, although it occupied a large share of public attention at the time, and constituted an important element in the case. This was the action of the Federal judiciary thereon, and the manner in which it was received. In 1854, a case, the well-known Dred Scott case, came before the Supreme Court of the United States, involving the whole question of the status of the African race and the rights of citizens of the Southern States to migrate to the territories, temporarily or permanently, with their slave property, on a footing of equality with the citizens of other States with their property of any sort. This question, as we have seen, had already been the subject of long and energetic discussion, without any satisfactory conclusion. All parties, however, had united in declaring that a decision by the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest judicial tribunal in the land, would be accepted as final. After long and patient consideration of the case, in 1857, the decision of the court was pronounced, in an elaborate and exhaustive opinion, delivered by Chief Justice Taney, a man eminent as a lawyer, great as a statesman, and stainless in his moral reputation, 7 of the 9 judges who composed the court concurring in it. The salient points established by this decision were: 1. That persons of the African race were not, and could not be, acknowledged as part of the people or citizens under the Constitution of the United States. 2. That Congress had no right to exclude citizens of the South from taking their negro servants as any other property into any part of the common territory, and that they were entitled to claim its protection therein. 3. And finally, as a consequence of the principle just above stated, that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, insofar as it prohibited the existence of African servitude north of a designated line, was unconstitutional and void. Footnote: The Supreme Court of the United States, in stating, through Chief Justice Taney, their decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857, say, quote, "In that portion of the United States where the labor of the negro race was found to be unsuited to the climate and unprofitable to the master, but few slaves were held at the time of the Declaration of Independence, and, when the Constitution was adopted, it had entirely worn out in one of them, and measures had been taken for its gradual abolition in several others. But this change had not been produced by any change of opinion in relation to this race, but because it was discovered from experience that slave labor was unsuited to the climate and productions of these States. For some of these States, when it had ceased, or nearly ceased, to exist, were actively engaged in the slave trade, procuring cargoes on the coast of Africa, and transporting them for sale to those parts of the Union where their labor was found to be profitable and suited to the climate and productions. And this traffic was openly carried on, and fortunes accumulated by it, without reproach from the people of the States where they resided." End quote. This statement, it must be remembered, does not proceed from any partisan source, but is extracted from a judicial opinion pronounced by the highest court in the country. In illustration of the truthfulness of the latter part of it, may be mentioned the fact that a citizen of Rhode Island, James De Wolfe, long and largely concerned in the slave trade, was sent from that State to the Senate of the United States as late as the year 1821. In 1825 he resigned his seat in the Senate and removed to Havana, where he lived for many years, actively engaged in the same pursuit, as president of a slave trading company. The story is told of him that on being informed that the trade was to be declared piracy, he smiled and said, "So much the better for us. The Yankees will be the only people not scared off by such a declaration." End of footnote. It will be remembered that it had already been declared inoperative and void by the Kansas-Nebraska Bill of 1854. Instead of accepting the decision of this then august tribunal, the ultimate authority in the interpretation of constitutional questions, as conclusive of a controversy that had so long disturbed the peace and was threatening the perpetuity of the Union, it was flouted, denounced, and utterly disregarded by the Northern agitators, and served only to stimulate the intensity of their sectional hostility. What resource for justice, what assurance of tranquility, what guarantee of safety, now remained for the South? Still forbearing, still hoping, still striving for peace and union, we waited until a sectional president, nominated by a sectional convention, elected by a sectional vote, and that the vote of a minority of the people was about to be inducted into office, under the warning of his own distinct announcement that the Union could not permanently endure half slave and half free, meaning thereby that it could not continue to exist in the condition in which it was formed and its Constitution adopted. The leader of his party, who was to be the chief of his cabinet, was the man who had first proclaimed an irrepressible conflict between the North and the South, and who had declared that abolitionism, having triumphed in the territories, would proceed to the invasion of the States. Even then the Southern people did not finally despair, until the temper of the triumphant party had been tested in Congress and found adverse to any terms of reconciliation consistent with the honor and safety of all parties. No alternative remained except to seek the security out of the Union which they had vainly tried to obtain within it. The hope of our people may be stated in a sentence. It was to escape from the injury and strife in the Union, to find prosperity and peace out of it. The mode and principles of their action will next be presented. End of chapter 10.